论坛的举办顺应了时代发展的潮流，是对全球化背景下教育问题的积极应对，突破了个人联系和双边合作的局限性，为全球教育学院院长建立了合作关系和网络，同时也为参会者创设了可以针对全球教育不同话题进行自由交流和分享观点的平台，对基于全球视野解决教育问题、凝聚共识、汇聚智慧、集聚力量具有重要的意义。
So this is our second Global Education Deans Forum, and this year we identified a topic to examine in some detail based on what the deans told us from the meeting in the first year, last year, that was also held here at ECNU in Shanghai. And the big focus this year has been on how do we move research to policy and research to practice. And we've had a series of presentations about that. We broke into smaller groups to see if we could identify common themes. And I think what we found is that there are a lot of common issues across the many countries that are represented in this meeting. We did realize that it takes a lot of responsibility on the part of deans to make sure that the work that we're doing in our universities and our research labs and the like are moving into the policy forum. We talked about how it's important that we engage on an ongoing systematic basis. One dean said that it should not be serendipitous, that you have to work continually to do it. You have to engage in communities of practice so that you're talking to practitioners, the people in the schools, so they're aware of the research that we're doing. We have to make our research more accessible. We have to make it more readable so that when they look at research or that we provide avenues for research, whether it be through social media like WeChat or Twitter or online, or whether it's in traditional papers and books, that it's in a format that makes sense to those that are going to have to apply it. And finally, one of the things that came up that we all agreed was a really good idea was that we at the university, at great universities like ECNU and all the universities represented here, at this conference, that we have the power of convening, where we can bring together practitioners and we can bring together policymakers, and we have the value of the research that we do, and we can bring them together to talk about it, so we make sure that the research that we're doing is entering into the policy discussions in each of the countries represented here, and then going down into the classrooms and the schools, so it makes the kind of impact that we all intend to make schools better places for students and for teachers.
I think that the relationship between research and practice and policy change, these are some of the most important questions I think we face in education. For institutions like ours, which are top in terms of research, the notion of how to make your research have an impact on policy, that's really what it's all about. Because it's no good to have research for its own sake. You really want to have that research have an impact on practice and be able to change and make the world a better place and make education as good as possibly can. But it's confusing and it's complex. And I think the importance of a conversation like this one is to understand what steps can a faculty of education take in order to strengthen that relationship and ensure that we have connections with policymakers, with practitioners, and do the very best that we possibly can to have research that's impactful and actually leads to change. And I think many of us are much better at the research piece than about the practice piece and about the notion of implementing and making that transition to policy. So the conversation we're having at this conference, I think, is extraordinarily important, because not only does it address what we as individuals might do within our faculties of education, but allows us to talk across cultures and across jurisdictions and learn from each other. Because I think that there are huge differences in our political and social economic contexts, but we can learn, I think, from each other in terms of the best way to think about transitioning research into practice and thinking about impact in terms of our research activities. So I think this is probably one of the most important conversations we can have in education, and I'm looking forward to this conversation very much.
I was asked to discuss how do you influence policy and practice. What are the most effective ways of influencing policy and practice? And I think one of the most effective ways of influencing policy and practice is to be a good neighbor with your schools, to be engaged with your schools. One way to be engaged is to work together with practitioners to develop research questions that they care about, but also other educators care about. But having them be part of a research team to help you identify what are the most relevant questions that we should address, and exactly the nature of those questions is very important. Also, then when you do the research, you need to have them involved in how you design the research. Because then the results at the end are useful results, results that your local community can use, your state or your region can use, because they were part of designing the questions. They are part of the research. And so therefore it is answering their questions, not necessarily your questions. And by answering their questions, it is, you are much more likely to have impact. And the important thing is that these relationships take a long time to develop, because relationships and working on research involve trust. And if there isn't trust, you can't work together. So I say you begin small, you begin with one project working together, then you move to another project that's even bigger. And by working together over time, there's trust between the university and the community, and they're more likely then, when you have research findings in other areas, to accept what you're doing. If people don't trust you, they're not likely to follow your advice. And so I say the most important thing is, if you want to have impact on policy and practice, is to develop a trusting relationship with the practitioners in your community. And you do that by working together and respecting them and their wisdom and the kinds of expertise that they bring. And so to me, if you want to develop and want to see that educators use much more evidence in their practice and are guided by evidence, they will have to trust you that you are bringing the right evidence to them. And so to me, that's the most important part of the relationship. And we have done this by developing a Tennessee Educational Research Alliance, where we have all the data from the state of Tennessee, and we help them answer questions, as they would say, just in time. And so policymakers now come to us and say, we are thinking about this policy. What does the research say? And how does it work in Tennessee? Because we've had this long-standing relationship for many, many years, they trust us to answer the question well, to answer it thoughtfully, and to answer it in an unbiased way. And as a result, I think we have much more likely to have impact. So thank you for asking me.
Well, perhaps I can speak from a particular context that I come from, and that is Scotland in the United Kingdom. I'm a professor of education, head of the School of Education and Sport in the university there, and I'm one of a number of deans in Scotland who get together to work with government, Scottish Government, but also with the General Teaching Council for Scotland, which represents teachers, and with unions. So there is a very integrated approach to the impact of research on policy and practice. As well, of course, we train teachers for primary and secondary schools in Scotland and internationally. So again, the research that we do very much impacts on practice in the classroom. I can give you a very concrete example of that. We're helping the City of Edinburgh to design new STEM schools and thinking particularly about the interior design of those schools and the curriculum. And one very specific aspect of that is the education of young people in data analysis. So our research at the university is helping those schools, those head teachers, the City of Edinburgh to think very hard about how to educate young people for the 21st century.
I think that the connection between research and practice is one of the most important things to consider for faculties in School of Education around the world. This should start, I believe that it should start at the beginning when a research project is first conceived, that you should be planning the research with practitioners to decide on research questions that are important and relevant, big issues, big problems, or the wicked problems of education should be the starting point for researchers. And researchers by themselves can't do that. They need that connection with the practitioners. Once a research project starts, for me, I've always worked with colleagues in the classroom. So it's we're dealing with the issues of their practice every day. And that's one reason why I think that so much of the research that might develop, so much of the results that might develop from our research seems to have some practical use for the teachers. For me, the most proudest moment of my own research projects is when I have a teacher say, I can use this in the classroom. This is really important for me, and that it's making a difference to their practice.
So I think a lot of this depends on the relationships that researchers have with either policymakers or practitioners. And that works in many different ways. So you have to be able to do research to answer questions that policymakers and practitioners have. So one of the things we try to do a lot of is actually be really in touch with politicians who are policymakers and teachers who are practitioners. So I think unless we get that relationship right, then what we find we're doing is answering questions that are very interesting to us, which is not a bad thing to do, but it's not necessarily going to influence the policy or the practice that we see in the country. So I guess that is probably the most important thing that we need to do, is to be much more engaged with what we call our practice communities, spending time in classrooms, spending time with teachers, finding out what problems they are trying to address, and actually then addressing those problems in a really methodical way. In New Zealand, a lot of research money is available, well, not a lot, a little bit of money is available for research that actually has to involve teachers in the research projects. And so that's where most of the money from the research grants goes, and is to draw teachers into the projects themselves, so that actually the projects are projects that they want answers to, they are questions that they want to answer, and that we can answer them together. And we've found that that's a very, very successful way in getting the practice changed. I guess one of the problems with that model, though, is that what we find is the practice sticks in the schools that those teachers come from, and sometimes doesn't actually get very far outside the system. So I think around the system. So I think one of the big things we have to address as education researchers is how do we spread the impact of those research outputs? How do we make them go from one school to another and go throughout the system? And that's something that we struggle with a lot.
El impacto que tiene la investigación en la práctica pedagógica de los maestros es bastante escasa. Por lo general, las investigaciones que se realizan en el ámbito universitario poco tienen que ver con las necesidades reales de los maestros, o bien, si se investiga, en el caso de España en concreto, se investiga para poder publicar y publicar en revistas de impacto, porque de estas publicaciones el resultado es que al final el profesor se puede acreditar y puede optar a una plaza de profesor. Pero el publicar en estas revistas de impacto no es útil para los que tendría que ser útil, que es los maestros que están trabajando en las escuelas, porque estos maestros no se leen ninguno de estos artículos de impacto. Yo creo que uno de los objetivos incluso de este fórum sería intentar hablar un poco de este tema y empezar a dar también prestigio a las publicaciones que se llevan a cabo en el ámbito de la divulgación, que es donde los maestros realmente acceden para saber cómo se va construyendo el conocimiento en las diferentes áreas del ámbito, de sus ámbitos de trabajo. De todas maneras, una de las cosas que sí que ha cambiado estos últimos años en las investigaciones en España, en las investigaciones educativas en España, es que se han ido incorporando maestros en los equipos de investigación. Durante muchos años los equipos de investigación de las universidades eran espacios cerrados en los cuales toda la sabiduría la tenían especialmente los profesores universitarios. Gracias a políticas que han fomentado la participación de maestros que están trabajando en la escuela en estos equipos de investigación, en los últimos años estos maestros han podido aportar su parte práctica a estas investigaciones, con lo cual se ha encontrado un cierto equilibrio entre la teoría que aportan los profesores universitarios y la práctica de estos maestros. Y al mismo tiempo pues está impactando algo más, a pesar de que sigue siendo escasa, como he dicho al principio, pero está impactando algo más en las escuelas, ¿no? Está ayudando a transformar la práctica pedagógica en las escuelas, sea de la escuela del tipo que sea, tanto si es una escuela urbana como si son escuelas rurales. Más allá de esta transformación o de este proceso de transformación, poco más se puede comentar. Yo creo que deberíamos seguir fomentando en los ámbitos universitarios y también en las administraciones públicas de que las investigaciones en educación puedan contar siempre con la presencia de maestros en activo, y además que las propuestas que se hagan de investigación sean también propuestas recogidas de las necesidades que surgen en el marco de las propias escuelas, no solo que sean temas tópicos que desde la universidad o desde los profesores universitarios consideramos que pueden ser de utilidad, sino también recoger todas aquellas propuestas, todas aquellas necesidades que los maestros en activo creen o necesitan que nosotros investiguemos en ese tema, ¿no? Siempre, repito, fomentando el trabajo en equipo con maestros en activo.
I'm glad to talk about the impact of research on policy and practice. And particularly what I'm going to focus on is my own research area, which is about private supplementary tutoring, out-of-school tutoring, which is a big issue here in China. And we know that the Chinese government has got new policies made in 2018. They are very far-reaching policies, and the question is, how does the research feed into those policies? Well, it's a complicated topic, and I'm focusing particularly on comparative education. I've looked at this topic in many different places. I think we do have research data. The challenge is to make it relevant and to reach the policymakers in a clear way. Often researchers are a bit too complicated, and they're also a bit too slow. So the researchers need to be able to distill the essence of what they are talking and then to deliver it in an easy to understand form so that it's also timely for the policy makers. And what I am seeing here is big advances in policy making on this topic of shadow education. It's often called shadow education, out of school, extra classes, which are very big here in China and affect millions of students. And I think the Chinese government is at the forefront of this and indeed has got some lessons which will be listened to in other countries. And so we can even learn from the Chinese experience and spread it to other countries as well.
So, in the United States, I've had the opportunity to study classrooms of effective teachers that have used evidence-based practices. And in studying those classrooms, I have seen how children's lives have been changed because they've been challenged. They have been provided opportunities and access to be successful. And we have to continue to advocate so that more evidence-based practices exist in policy, and also infrastructure and funding, so that ultimately people will be have the potential to influence in their communities and in our society. And without that, we're going to continue to see different communities where children and people unfortunately do not have the opportunities to learn and to influence others. And so ultimately, we have to expand our pockets of excellence to more communities. And we can only do that by taking research to policy and to practice. And then the other way, I really see this as interdependent, that research, practice, and policy should be interdependent and should influence one another, so that we're all working together to improve other lives. So, thank you.
Hi, I'm Bob Floden, the Dean of the College of Education for Michigan State University. One of the things that we try to do at Michigan State University is to use research, our own and those of other people, to help improve the lives of students in Michigan, in the United States, and in the world by influencing policy and practice. I think in influencing policy, it's most important to start with the questions that the policymakers are most interested in. So, for example, right now we're working on a study of the influence of a new policy which will be looking at students in third grade and deciding whether or not they progress to fourth grade on the basis of a reading test and some other information. We're going to be looking at how this policy is actually implemented and what its effects are on the learning of students. And in doing this, we'll be constantly updating the policymakers of what we're learning so they can see how they might adjust the policy and whether this policy is in fact a good thing to be continuing to do. Doing this involves also making sure that we provide brief, clear updates in writing, in ordinary language, as well as meeting with them directly and answering their questions. In this way, we hope to be able to inform them about the effects of a policy that they put in place. Thank you very much.
Education research is definitely very important for policy and practice. And I think for it to have an effect and an impact, education researchers must learn to speak in a language that practitioners as well as policymakers will understand and will appreciate. And very often this is a language that we all need to learn.
Education research has a great deal of impact on education practice, and it is our obligation and the obligation of researchers to help translate our research into practice. When we do research, we do not want to do it in an ivory tower or to do it just for the purpose of doing the research. We should be addressing and investigating issues that are important to society, that help address societal challenges. And so when we complete a research, we want to make sure that we communicate this research to people in the profession and academia, but also that we communicate it in a way that others can understand, that we use a language that people in the public and policymakers can readily interpret and apply to their work.
So I think when it comes to impact of our research, it's an issue that we really need to think about very seriously, particularly for those of us who are in schools of education. And that is because the opportunity to have an effect on practice is actually great. In our work with schools, in our work with school children, in our work with teachers and practitioners, it is possible to make connections between the work that we do and the work that they do in order to improve education for children.
예, 교육 정책에 대한 연구는 매우 중요하다고 생각합니다. 특히 새로운 그 환경의 변화에 대한 교육 정책의 변화가 매우 중요하게 생각되어지는데요. 무엇보다 중요한 것은 정책도 중요하지만 이 정책이 잘 실현되기 위한 과정들이 더욱더 중요하다고 생각합니다. 이러한 정책이 잘 실현되어지기 위해서는 무엇보다도 현장의 요구가 잘 반영되어지고 또 주변 지역 사회의 맥락의 변화에 잘 요구에 적응되어질 수 있는 그런 정책이 실현을 가능하게 할 것이라고 생각합니다. 한국에서는 이러한 교육 정책의 실현을 위해서 학교와 지역사회와 대학이 연계되어지는 그러한 교육 정책이 실현되어지고 있습니다. 그래서 저희 대학에서는 지역교육청과 대학이 함께 이루어지는 함께 하나의 공동기구가 설치되어져서 교수학습 공동체를 지금 운영되어지고 있습니다. 이런 사례를 통해서 현장의 교육관리자, 현장의 교사, 그리고 예비교사, 또 대학 교수들이 함께하는 그런 교수학습 공동체가 이루어지고 있습니다.
I think there are many things that schools of education can do to improve or deepen their impact on educational policy and practice. First of all, I think that we should, in the choice we have of what we're going to research, that is problems that schools, school districts, universities face, we should choose to examine those. We should choose to ask the field, what knowledge do they think they need that our research faculty can attempt to give some answers to. So definitely I think this notion of asking the field, what do they want to know more about? Secondly, I think it's where we disseminate our research. Now, we've spent quite a bit of time today talking about the difference between what faculty will get rewarded for as faculty in research universities and what practitioners read in order to understand how to improve their practice. So I do think that we need to encourage our faculty to use multiple types of communication vehicles. So yes, we want you to be in high impact journals. There's a body of knowledge that ought to be disseminated through that. But also if we want to improve practice, and for me practice means what's happening in a classroom, what's happening in a school or a school district, then we need to disseminate that through multiple communication avenues, including social media, including policy briefs, including going out and talking about it, being asked to come on a professional development day to a school and talk about relevant research. And then last, when it comes to policy, I think we have to be patient and we have to begin developing relationships with policymakers. In the United States, that means talking with people in your state capital. For me, that as a Californian, that'd be up in Sacramento. Also, school boards, superintendents, that you have to have their trust that what you're doing can and will make a difference. So that's a long time. Sometimes there are many, that's going to take a while and you need to be patient to develop it. Otherwise, you can do great research, you can answer questions, but people are not going to believe that you really understand the context of where your research may go.
I think it's a very difficult thing for education schools to understand, because having an impact on policy and practice is in many ways is the ultimate goal of many schools of education, and yet it's probably much more difficult to have a direct impact on policy than it is necessarily to have on practice. So a lot of attention tends to be paid to policy influence, but actually what we should do is try to co-create a lot more of our research so that we involve the stakeholders in the design of the research questions, as well as the way in which we then consider the long-term impact of the research. So rather than just doing a piece of research and then moving on to another, as many academics do with a view to publication, it's very important that we actually stay connected to these communities in the long term. That's the way in which you can have an impact, a real impact on practice as well as policy. And so in the UK, where I come from, there's a lot of emphasis now on the impact of research on policy and practice. But one of the difficult things to gain is really good, solid evidence about the way in which your research has actually impacted on policy and practice. And the only real way of doing that is to ensure that you are genuinely committed to the people that are going to be the subject of your research. And so that is the way I think that we can try to improve our practice.
As we've heard here at the Global Education Deans Forum, I think that we have a lot of examples of universities engaging in partnerships, both with schools and with various governmental authorities. And it's through these partnerships and through conversations with both policymakers and practitioners that university faculty are able to inform the decisions that are being made with the latest empirical knowledge that we have from research. This is probably the most important contribution that universities have to make. Universities are in the business of generating and testing knowledge. And both practitioners and policymakers need the latest empirical information to make the best possible decisions around both policy and practice.
其实在我们中国，教育学院在政策和实践方面的影响力，我认为是有比较好的基础。但是面对未来教育的挑战，我认为我们教育学院在对政策和实践的影响力方面，应该可以更加的主动。比如说，我们在这个政策的这个制定上，作为我们教育学院，应该更加的主动的去了解国家的需要、人才培养的需要，然后使我们的这个研究与国家的这种需要紧密结合。第二个方面呢，我觉得也是我们高校教育学院的一种优势，因为我们的教育学院呢与基础教育是紧密相关的。比如说像我们浙江师范大学教师教育学院，我们现在就确立了面向教育现场的基础教育和教师教育研究，这样的一种聚焦呢，是让我们的教师和研究者深入到这个教育的现场，然后为基础教育，包括为我们这个师范生面向未来的卓越的师范生的培养呢，这个有更多的一手的资料， 还有的话呢，可以通过我们的这个合作办学，像我们学院就有23所的附属学校，通过对合作办学的教师的这种专业的成长、课堂的变革等等，那么这样的话呢，我们对基础教育，也就是对教育实践的这种影响，也是非常直接而深刻的。
I think research, educational research, impacts policy and practice in several ways. First, I would say in sort of helping set the agenda. What are the most important issues to be discussed? What are the topics that are of greatest concern to policymakers and practitioners? And I think as part of doing that work, one of the responsibilities of schools of education is making sure they're engaged with their communities, their local school districts, parents, stakeholders, and educational organizations writ large, helping to determine what exactly are the issues. One example of that in educational research in the United States today is the issue of safe schools, safe and healthy schools. And that's an area, for example, where we do a lot of research around topics related to safe schools, but it's clear that in the case of making schools safer places, education schools have a lot more to do. So parents, school districts, and principals are in the trenches doing the work, trying to make sure that they're making their schools safe and healthier, thriving places for the students they serve. And schools of education, in fact, need to catch up to that, start to do research around topics that are applied and translational in the area of safe schools, and provide evidence that supports and tools that help school leaders make better decisions about how they can make their schools safer places. I think we also have a responsibility when it comes to policymakers to making sure that policymakers are better educated about the topics and about what constitutes actual evidence-based policy. There's a lot of work being done by for-profit vendors, particularly in developed countries like the United States, where the claim is that it's evidence-based work, but in fact it's not evidence-based. There haven't been rigorous research trials that have been engaged to support that research, and schools of education need to step in and make sure policymakers understand what practices, what policies, what research is actually supported by evidence, as opposed to the research that's being provided by vendors that in some cases isn't evidence-based.
教育学院在这个政策研究中，这个能够发挥非常大的作用。这个教育学院呢，它能够通过这个，规划自己的发展方向，确定自己办学定位方面呢，能够有意识地参与到这个教育政策的研究之中，我们现在呢，大多数学院都非常重视这个教育政策研究这一块。为什么呢？因为呢，教育学院呢重视这一块，对自己的这个办学地位提升非常有帮助。比如说对自己的课题获得，对自己的社会影响这个产生，都有非常直接的影响。大家都知道呢，在中国呢，我们这个课题呢，政策导向非常强。我们因为都是做的应用性研究为主的，所以呢，如果说不做政策研究，就可能呢失去了这个获得重大科研课题的机会，这样呢就对学院的发展或者对个体的发展都非常不利所以呢，政策研究呢，对于这个学院发展非常有利，但同时呢，也对这个我们老师的晋升职务非常有利。这个晋升职务的影响呢，主要体现在呢，我们发表论文上面。我们的这个国内的期刊呢，这个一般都会围绕着政策的导向来进行选题，再进行刊登，所以呢，能够抓住政策热点呢，很容易被这个选中。所以呢，这是我们老师在这个发展过程中也是一个捷径。这种捷径呢，当然了，也需要呢我们老师本身呢有这个很高的研究素养，能够抓住政策要点，能够把自己的理论素质呢，这个转化在这个政策研究方向上来，不然的话就很容易这个错过这个良机。
The topic of this year's event is to explore the interrelationship between research, practice, and policymaking in the field of education. As a premier faculty of education in the world, the UCL Institute of Education is obviously really interested in the nexus of these three important areas, and a lot of the work that we undertake very much focuses on ensuring that we are on the one hand able to generate useful insights that will support and help policymakers to bring about legislation and changes that will help the education system nationally as well as internationally to improve life chances for children and young people and ensure that they're able to enjoy satisfactory and transformative life experiences. So one particular focus for us is about the generation of new evidence and new research that is relevant and speaks to the big challenges that society faces. And we try to engage very closely with policymakers in understanding the particular challenges and the particular issues that they wish to address and intend to tackle through their various interventions. There are of course significant challenges in ensuring a strong relationship between research and policy making and practice because for one the time lag between producing research evidence and then applying it meaningfully through policy in practice is challenging. So by the time useful evidence about certain issues exists, the public debate might have moved on and new topics and new issues are of interest. So one of the things we're obviously trying to do is identify key themes and key topics for us to focus our research and work on. And events like today really help shape a better understanding internationally by bringing together deans from leading schools of education in the world to share their understandings of what the key challenges in the world of education and schooling and higher education and all other aspects of social science really are. So collectively we can develop appropriate approaches to develop a research and evidence base that supports policy making internationally, trying to be complementary in what we do to ensure that there is a minimum of replication and only as much replication as is necessary to really test the validity of particular approaches, ensure depth in our understanding of particular areas, but at the same time ensure complementarity to enable us collectively to cover a wide range of different areas of interest. Institutionally, it's really important to focus on the interface between the generation of new evidence and insights and the translatability of that evidence for a wider audience. So good research requires to be methodologically rigorous, requires for really specialist methodological approaches to be used, for strong conceptual and theoretical frameworks to be used to ensure analytical rigor and so forth. And it requires specialist expertise which consumers of research won't necessarily immediately have. So we as institutions of higher education and schools of education have a particular role, not just in generating the evidence, but also in translating the evidence into forms that lend themselves to sharing publicly and for intelligible debate with policymakers and the wider public. And my hope for the event here and the work of the group is that together we can become better, not just at generating evidence, but at also finding better ways of sharing with policymakers the wealth of insights that we have to help them make better policies and support them in their endeavour by having useful insights to offer them.
So I run a college with a very clear mission to transform inequitable systems of education. So that means everything that my faculty and that I do as a dean is to have relevance and impact in young people's lives and in communities' lives and families' lives. So in answer to that question about how do we bring research to policy, how do we bring research to practice, it's not a question to me. It's always about the deliverables and how do we actually do that in real time, in real and meaningful ways that affect lives, people's lives.
Coming to this Global Deans Forum has been a great opportunity for many deans of education to talk together and to learn from each other about how to influence policy and practice in school systems. It's important for us to be able to use our research and the strong evidence base to help schools and school systems to improve outcomes for young people, to make sure that every person is successful and has a fulfilling life.
教育研究那个种类很多，有学术研究，有专业研究，也有那个政策研究。那么作为一个教育学院来讲的话，它既有这样三项那个研究的那个功能，但是从我们以往的情况来看的话，主要是学术研究为主。但是随着这几年那个对教育那个实践和政策的影响的关注，所以呢也越来越重视那个政策研究和实践的研究。像我们教育学院的话，一个基本的那个立场和态度的话，就是重视、扶持、尊重那个学术研究，但是大力鼓励或者是支持政策的研究和实践的一种研究那么通过那个我们的一系列的那个政策的那个引导，这几年的那个政策的研究和实践研究有了很大的那个提升以实践研究为例的话，我们教育学院跟杭州市滨江区、萧山区合作，创办了1所辅助学校和2所实验学校，对这个基础教育的那个质量的那个提升做出了重要的一个贡献那么当然我们还有很多工作需要做因为这些政策研究也好，还是实践研究也好，它必须是政府、学校大学之间的一个紧密的一个合作，只有这样的话，才能把政策研究基于科学研究的基础上能够转化、能够落地。那么实践研究更加如此就是必须跟那个所在的学校、老师、同学一起来进行那个沟通，来展开合作的研究。所以在这一方面我们尽管有很多的那个成绩但是还有很大的那个提升的那个空间我就说谢谢大家
So often we think there's a big divide between research and practice. Research is something that we do at universities. There are people who have lots of academic training and think great thoughts, and practice is something that takes place on the front lines in schools where people are actually trying to change the world. But this separation between research and practice is a false opposition. That people at universities do a lot of practical things. They change the world in various ways in terms of having budgets and engaging in politics and doing lots of practical stuff. But more importantly, in schools, people also do theory. It's a mistake to think that practitioners just do while researchers think. Practitioners have theories about how it is that children learn and how we can help them more effectively learn. And practitioners also have theories. They also develop evidence in order to try to support their ideas. So giving a test, asking a student a question, is a form of empirical research. It gathers data. So what we at universities can do is we can help practice improve by expanding their repertoires. Practitioners have lots of ideas, they have theories, they engage in using those ideas while they try to help young people learn. But people at universities are particularly good at thinking through conceptualizations and building on other people's accounts of the world, and also at gathering evidence and analyzing it systematically. So when I think of what we do at Boston College, that we try to expand practitioners' repertoires. By that I mean, we're not helping practitioners do something they don't already do. They already have concepts, build theories, gather evidence, and improve their practice. But we can help them by giving them specific tools that can help them do those things more effectively. By helping them learn some data collection and data analysis techniques, we can allow them to do what they're already doing in a way that is even more robust. By giving them some new conceptualizations, we can help them improve their practice by stretching the kinds of ideas that they use to make sense of what young people do. So the expansion of repertoires is a useful way to think about how a university can contribute to practitioners, not by giving them a qualitatively different kind of knowledge, but by helping them do what they already do in a way that's augmented.
我想呢，对于大学来讲，人才培养、科学研究和社会服务这3个功能、3个职能是大学主要的应该完成的任务。这里面呢，科学研究是它履行人才培养和社会服务必要的一个前提和基础。换句话来说，正因为大学有雄厚的研究经历、雄厚的研究基础，它才可以去做人才培养和社会服务的工作。所以呢，我想这个科学研究要跟教学，也就是人才培养和社会服务形成一种互构的关系。也就是说，我们的教学工作肯定呢要以科学研究为前提、为基础，为创新的一个增长点。同时呢，社会服务呢，也要以我们的科学研究作为一个前提，作为它的一个必要性和可能性。所以在中国来讲，我想，要想让自己的科学研究产生价值、产生意义，一定要对国家的政策有所研究，最后有所干预，有所影响。同时呢，对于实践的课堂教学。实践中的学校的文化，实践中的教师的专业发展，也要产生它的必要的一些价值。产生价值，产生影响。那么，我想一个非常重要的一个因素，就是要有一种机制，有一种机制让我们的研究对政策产生影响，有一种机制让我们跟中小学的教师、校长有深度的合作。那么现在呢，对于政策的影响，我想这个机制还是非常多的。我们有很多的项目课题都是由国家或省政府它来委托大学来进行研究，所以我想这里面有一个非常畅通的或者稳定的合作机制。那么和中小学的联系呢，我想也可以建立很多的机制，比如说现在很多师范大学与中小学进行的院校合作，UGS、UAS 等等这样的合作，也是通过一种机制平台，让大学的研究和中小学的实践能够互构、双赢、互利、互惠。
Research in education has the possibility of having a huge impact on both policy and practice. I think the important thing, however, is to think about it as developing relationships, whether those are relationships with ministries of education or with school districts or with individual teachers working in classrooms. So once that relationship is built and built on trust, then one can move on to asking collaborative research questions, which we can answer to inform policy, which we can answer to inform practice at a variety of levels, including teacher practice in classrooms.
I think in the old days we had a very clear and simple view of the relationship between research, policy and practice. We expected education departments in universities to conduct research. We expected that research to be taken on board by policymakers in designing the policies, and then the policymakers implemented them and they went into effect in practice. Now, I think that's how we used to think about it. I'm not sure if it ever really worked like that, but certainly it was a persuasive argument. Now, it's much more complex. I think as universities, we're interested in policy, practice and research in equal measures. We expect practice to be a site of research. We don't just expect teachers and educators to implement research findings. We actually expect them to be researchers, to conduct inquiries at local level. We don't just expect policymakers to be passive recipients of research. We expect them to engage as research partners, not simply as funders. We also conduct research on policy, and universities can often find themselves as key players in the design of policies as much as they do in the design of research. And finally, as universities, we're also interested in the quality of the impact that research has on practice and the quality of the practice and the experience of children, students and young people and adults in all educational settings. That makes it more complex, it makes it more interesting, and it also makes the responsibility of university education departments and their impact, it makes it far more significant.
教育学院对这个教育政策和实践的影响，一个是通过学者的影响，比如说和英国伦敦大学这个 Gary Williams 教授合作写的这个文章，对国际的高等教育政策影响就很大。第二种就是研究团队，比如说全国人大这个7月份委托我做的一个项目，直接委托的，那么我完成了以后，他们反馈也不错。这种呢是属于非正式组织的，既不属于某个大学的教育学院的，但是实际上是多校园的团队的一个组合，我们完成的也相当不错。这是一种第二种方式。第三种方式就直接写咨询报告，因为我本身也是这个全国教育智库的联盟的顾问委员会副主任所以也会组织一些各种各样的一些考察这个专业咨询这种也是一种。另外教育学院呢实际上像我，因为我也是校长助理兼教育学院院长，所以我还可以组织就是跨学科之间的这种共同工作，这个又是一种方式。那么还有一种就约定，比如说政府约定我们的任务，约定我们的稿件，这还是另外的一种方式。所以我们的实践和政策的咨询这些方面呢，有的是合二为一，有的可能有分离。但是整体上方式方法是多种多样的甚至我们也有做一些对基层的一些指导，比如说在贵州我们还可以做一些乡村教育和民主教育的影响。谢谢。
The research that we are conducting, and I'm specifically now going to refer to the context in South Africa, is to an extent impacting practice and policy, but maybe not sufficient. And there might be many reasons for that. It could be, on the one hand, that some of the studies that we are doing are not really addressing the burning questions in the country. The research that is impacting policy and practice would be the research that was identified not only by us as academics, but in collaboration with the departments of education. They assist us to understand what would they like to be researched. Now, by that I'm not saying that we shouldn't be also initiating research projects. And secondly then, when we initiate research projects that we view as important, how do we communicate our findings? That is crucial. In other words, are we communicating these findings only in academic journals? That's fine. But if you only do that, it means you would not reach a wider audience. And the audience that we want to reach would be our teachers, our school principals, those people who are working in policy. And to communicate with them, we need different avenues, not only academic type of dissemination.